There were 3 things the neighborhood didn't know about Walt. The quiet widower who spent Saturday mornings fixing the fence so the kids on the cul-de-sac wouldn't cut themselves on the wire. And they all came out the afternoon a 20-year-old in gym shorts threw a pair of fighting gloves at his feet. They didn't know that the man who drove a 10-year-old truck with a broken stereo control knob had spent 20 years in the Navy. They didn't know that his home office, which they assumed handled something administrative, actually ran security assessments for industrial facilities worth more than every house on the block combined. And they didn't know that the last time someone had grabbed him and refused to let go, he had been wearing 40 pounds of gear in the dark, and everyone on his team had come home. The collision on the grass was going to test exactly how long that restraint could hold against an opponent who wanted a public victory over a man who wouldn't fight back. Because what happens when a spoiled black belt finds out the quiet dad he's been pushing was trained to end fights in places where nobody kept score? You won't want to miss how this plays out. Reese was washing the Silverado in the driveway when Tanner from across the property line walked over and snapped the stereo control knob off with a twist of his wrist that was almost casual, almost bored, and the crack of plastic carried across the quiet Saturday morning the way a single wrong note carries through a room full of people who are waiting for something to happen. He was wearing gym shorts and a sleeveless shirt, and he held the broken knob up for a moment, as if to admire it before dropping it in the driveway and walking back across the grass toward his own house, laughing without looking back. Walt came out of the front door before Tanner had reached the property line. The sound had carried through the open kitchen window where he had been standing with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. And he stood on the porch for a moment with the same quiet attention he gave to everything. The way you check a room for what has changed since you last saw it. He did not speak. He walked down the steps to the driveway, picked up the broken knob from where it had landed near the front tire, and examined it in his palm for a moment before pulling his phone from his pocket and taking a photograph of it. Then he took a photograph of the truck's dashboard where the knob had been, the plastic control stripped away to leave the bare metal D-shaft exposed. Reese had stopped washing the truck. She stood holding the sponge in one hand, water dripping from it onto the cracked concrete, watching her father with the patient stillness of someone who has learned to wait for what comes next. Tanner was across the property line now, standing in his own driveway next to a heavy bag that hung from a metal frame, and his father stood in the garage doorway watching too, saying nothing. His arms crossed over his chest in a posture that said he had already decided how something would end. Walt looked at Tanner across the property line and said, in a voice that carried no anger and no heat, just a statement of fact, spoken the way a surveyor reads a boundary, that stays on your side from now on. Tanner left again and hit the heavy bag once, hard, with a sound that carried across the space between the 2 houses. Walt walked back to the porch and called the non-emergency police line. He stood there with the broken knob still in his hand, the phone pressed to his ear, and he gave his name and his address, and the nature of the incident in the same calm voice he used when he was reading a report, precise and unhurried, because he had learned that the only thing you can control is the accuracy of what you say. Officer Callahan arrived within the hour, having caught the dispatch while patrolling the next street over. He was a young man, maybe 30, with the careful posture of someone who has learned to keep his hands visible and his voice neutral. He looked at the broken knob that Walt held out to him, looked at the truck, and shook his head. For property damage under $50, you're supposed to file online, sir, he said. He wrote something on a card, handed it over, and told Walt that this was a civil matter, not a criminal one, and that the incident number would be in the system if it was needed later. Bob back in his car and drove away. Walt stood in the driveway holding the police card, a small rectangle of paper that summarized what had happened and what would not happen. And he read it with the same attention he gave to any document, absorbing the ink and what it meant, which was that nothing was going to come of this. He walked to the truck and sat in the driver's seat with the door open, 1 foot on the ground, and he reached into the center console tray past a gas receipt from the Shell on Route 33 and a loose bolt from the fence repair and a worn brass-colored coin that he hadn't picked up in years. And he pulled out a pen. He wrote the date on the back of the receipt and the words "Broken Control Knob, Neighbor's Son, Incident Filed." in his small, even handwriting, recording the details the same careful way he recorded everything, because he had learned that memory was not reliable and paper was. Reese had finished drawing the truck with the radio now silent, and she stood next to him with a towel over her shoulder and said, "He only picks on people when he knows they won't hit back. That's not strong. That's just mean." She meant Tanner. She was talking about Tanner, the way he had chosen a truck that could not defend itself, and a father who had called the police instead of calling Tanner's name across the property line. But Walt heard something else in it, something that settled into him like a weight he knew he would carry later. He nodded once and looked across the property line at Tanner, who was hitting the heavy bag now in a steady rhythm, the chain creaking with each impact, and at Gordon, who stood in the garage doorway watching his son with the focused attention of a man who is invested in the outcome. Walt walked back into the house and into his home office, where a folding table held a laptop and a stack of spiral-bound facility assessment reports and a mug from the Columbus Metro Fire 5K, and he set the police card down on the desk next to the broken knob. He stood there for a moment, looking at the two things side by side, the plastic and the paper, and he understood that the system had done exactly what the system was designed to do, which was to tell him that what had happened was not serious enough for anyone else to act on. He was still standing there when he heard footsteps on the driveway, and he walked back to the front door to find Gordon standing at the property line, not quite on his side, not quite on the other, in that space that belongs to neither owner. "I heard you called the police," Gordon said. His voice was calm and flat, the voice of a man who is used to being listened to. "Stay away from my son." Walt looked at him for a long moment. He did not say anything. He did not nod. He simply stood there in the doorway of his house, holding the broken knob in his hand, the police report sitting on the desk behind him, and he watched Gordon turn and walk back across the property line to his own driveway, where Tanner was still hitting the heavy bag in the Saturday morning quiet. The study group met in the driveway on Sunday afternoon, a folding table set up between the truck and the house, 3 textbooks open, a laptop balanced on a stack of notebooks. Reese sat with her back to the street, her pencil moving across a page in the steady rhythm of someone who has walked the same path 100 times. And the other 2 girls leaned in over their own pages in the quiet rhythm of studying. Tanner appeared from the other side of the property line. He walked across the lawn without hurry, the way a person walks when he knows nobody will stop him, and stopped at the edge of the folding table, close enough that one of the girls had to lean back to keep him from her space. "That your dad's truck?" he said to Reese. "The one with the busted knob? Leave us alone." "I'm just asking a question. He called the cops on me for touching his truck. That's what he does, right? Calls people instead of handling things himself." One of the other girls began packing her things, sliding her notebook into her bag. Reese set her pencil down. "He's not the one who breaks things," she said. Tanner stood there for another moment, long enough to make the silence uncomfortable, and then he walked back across the property line, not hurrying, not looking back. That evening, Walt was working near the property line, on his knees at the edge of the driveway with a trowel in his hand, pressing the soil around the shrubs Tanner had damaged the week before. He heard the footsteps before he saw Tanner. Tanner came across the property line without slowing, without announcing himself. He reached down and grabbed Walt's shirt at the collar and pulled him up onto his knees and said, "Your daughter needs to learn some respect." Walt did not think about what happened next. His hand came up and found Tanner's wrist at the point where the tendons ran under the skin, and his thumb pressed into the space between the bones, and his other hand met Tanner's elbow, and he turned his own body the way a door turns on its hinge, and Tanner's grip opened, and his weight followed the path Walt's hands had made for it, and Tanner dropped to one knee on the packed earth of the property line. It took less than 2 seconds. Tanner stayed there for a moment, on one knee, his hand still open where the grip had been, confusion on his face like someone who has just been shown something he cannot name. He scrambled up and looked at Walt with something that was not quite anger yet, not quite fear, but was moving toward one of them. Walt stood up slowly. He did not say anything. He picked up the trowel and went back to the shrubs. Tanner walked back across the property line without looking back. his mind still trying to name what had just happened. Tanner found his father in the garage and told him the neighbor had sucker punched him with a cheap trick. Gordon listened with the focused attention of a man who has already decided what he believes, his head nodding once. "I'll handle it," he said. Gordon walked to the property line that evening and stood in that space that belongs to neither owner and said, "If you touch my son again, I will bury you in legal fees. I will make calls. I will use every piece of influence I have. Do you understand me?" Walt stood at his own front door, the screen between them, and looked at Gordon with the stillness of a man studying a wall he knows he cannot move. He did not say anything. He watched Gordon turn and walk back across the property line. Walt went inside and closed the door. He did not tell anyone what had happened. He did not call the police. He simply walked to the kitchen and filled a glass of water from the tap and drank it, standing at the counter, his hand steady, and set the glass down in the sink and went back to the office, where the broken knob still sat on the desk next to the police report. Explaining the movement would mean revealing the training, and the training was not something he wanted discussed. Roy heard about the dispute through the ordinary channels of neighborhood friction. A woman mentioned the damaged shrubs. A man mentioned that the study group had packed up early. Roy listened with the non-committal attention of someone gathering weather reports, absorbing information without deciding what it means. He did not want to choose sides. He told the woman he would look into it, told the man he would keep an ear open, and went back to his own house and thought about what he had heard. Tanner had a pattern. The heavy bag in the driveway, the way he talked to delivery workers, to teenagers, to anyone who did not have the weight to push back. Roy had seen it before, in other places, other people, and he knew that the difference between youthful energy and something else was not always visible from the outside. Not at first, not until the pattern had repeated enough times that it could not be mistaken for anything else. He kept the doubt to himself. He was new to the role. He did not want to choose sides. Tanner sat in the basement of a friend's house that night. 3 other young men around a table that held a case of beer and a set of gym keys, and he told them what had happened. He told them about the sucker punch, the cheap trick, the way the neighbor had caught him off guard and put him on one knee before he knew what was happening. He told it the way a person tells a story he has already begun to believe, the details shifting slightly with each telling, the confusion hardening into something that felt more like certainty. One of the other young men said, "Sounds like a fluke. You want to go back and show him what a real hit feels like?" Tanner looked at his own hand, still open on the table. The memory of the grip opening, the weight following a path he had not chosen. He did not know what had happened. He only knew that he needed to prove it had been a fluke. "We could get gloves," another one said. "Make it a fair fight." Tanner nodded slowly, agreeing to something he had not yet fully decided, and the other young men leaned in, their voices dropping to the low register of planning, and the listener knew that this was no longer spontaneous, no longer the heat of a moment that would cool overnight. It was becoming a plan. Walt texted Roy on the Thursday before Labor Day, the message short and practical, asking whether both families were still attending the cookout, whether there was a seating plan, whether the children should be kept separate. He typed the message twice before sending it, reading it once for clarity and once for tone, then pressed send and set the phone face up on the counter. Roy responded within the hour. His message was careful, the kind of message a person writes when he does not want to commit to anything but does not want to seem evasive. He said he was sure it would be fine, that everyone could keep some space, that the layout would work itself out. Walt read the message twice, reading something that was not quite what he asked for but close enough to accept, and set the phone back down without replying. What Walt did not know was that Roy had already begun to adjust the layout. He moved the folding tables so that the 2 families would not be adjacent. He placed the grills at one end and the coolers at the other, creating a natural separation that did not look deliberate. This was not a confrontation, not an accusation. It was a small shift in the arrangement of chairs and tables, the kind of shift a person makes when he wants to prevent something without having to name it. Walt walked the common area the day before the cookout, alone, In the late afternoon, when the light was long and the air was still, he walked the perimeter first, noting where the ground slopes near the fire pit, where the grass was uneven, where a folding table leg would need to be shimmed to sit level. He noted the position of the grills, the line of tables, the route back to his own house through the gap in the hedges. He was not looking for trouble. He was looking at the ground the way a person looks at ground he has been trained to read, seeing an open field and knowing without thinking where the cover is and where it is not. At the edge of the fire pit, he stood still for a long moment, the ground uneven beneath his feet, and looked back toward his own front door. The distance was not great. He could cover it in a few seconds if he needed to. He hoped he would not need to. That evening, he asked Reese about her plans for the cookout. She said she wanted to sit with the friends from her study group, that they had already arranged to bring a blanket and sit near the far end of the common area where the shade was. Walt listened and nodded, and did not tell her that he had already noted the sight lines from that spot, that he could see it clearly from the gap in the hedges, that he had already planned how he would check on her without making it obvious. He simply agreed and told her to bring a jacket in case the evening cooled down. Tanner was at the gym that same afternoon, the heavy bag swinging on its chain, the sound of the strikes echoing off the mirrored walls. Two friends stood nearby, stretching on the mats, watching him work through combinations, measuring, comparing, looking for the gap between what they see and what they believe about themselves. He'd been telling the story for weeks now. The cheap trick. The sucker punch. The way the neighbor had caught him off guard and put him on one knee before he knew what was happening. He told it the way a person tells a story he has told so many times that the details have smoothed into something like fact, the confusion gone, the certainty solidifying with each repetition. One of the friends, the one who had been lifting longest, straightened from his stretch and said, "You should spar him. Show him up, we'll record it." Tanner stopped the bag with his forearm and stood still, breathing. The idea settled into him, close enough to feel like it belonged. He looked at the friend and nodded slowly, agreeing to something he had already begun to believe was inevitable. By the time he left the gym, he had convinced himself of three things. The gloves made it consensual, a fair fight between two men who had agreed to settle something. The phones would record it, would show that he had not started it, that he had only responded, and his father's money would handle whatever came after, the way it always had, the way it always would. All three beliefs were wrong. He did not know that yet. He felt the weight of the key in his pocket, the key to the friend's gym locker where the gloves were waiting, and he felt certain. The morning of the cookout was warm and clear, the sky a pale blue that promised an afternoon of sun. Walt and Reese loaded the cooler into the truck bed, the folding chair next to it, the blanket folded on top. The radio in the truck was off. The silence a small piece of unfinished business that neither of them mentioned. They walked to the common area together. The cooler between them. The afternoon settling around them like a room that was still being arranged. Families were setting up. Chairs unfolding. Grills lighting. Children running across the grass. Roy waved from across the common area, his hand raised in a greeting that looked ordinary, looked normal, looked like any Labor Day in any neighborhood in the country. Walt waved back. The surface of the afternoon was suburban and calm. The kind of afternoon a person remembers without having to think about it. The kind that feels like it belongs to no particular year. Then the silver charger turned into the cul-de-sac, the aftermarket exhaust rumbling through the quiet air, and Tanner stepped out in gym shorts. Three friends followed, unfolding chairs, carrying coolers, and one of them, the one who had been lifting longest, was holding a pair of red boxing gloves by the laces, the way a person carries something he is looking forward to using. Tanner crossed the common area in his gym shorts, the red gloves hanging from one hand, his friends following with the folding chairs and the cooler, and he stopped in front of Walt with the kind of deliberate stillness that a person practices when he has been imagining a moment for weeks. He looked at Walt and then he looked down at the grass between them and he dropped the gloves, letting them fall the way a person drops something he no longer needs to carry, the weight of them settling into the grass at Walt's feet. "Put them on," Tanner said. Walt looked at the gloves on the grass. Red leather. the laces still tied the way they had been at the gym. He did not pick them up. "No," he said. Tanner raised his voice then, loud enough for the tables nearby to hear, loud enough for the families setting out their paper plates to stop what they were doing and turn. He called Walt a coward. He described the cheap trick from the property line, the way Walt had caught him off guard, the way he had been put on one knee before he knew what was happening. He told the story to the gathering crowd with the polished certainty of someone who has worn the truth down to whatever fit the shape he needed. Walt listened. He did not interrupt. When Tanner finished, he said it again, quietly, the same word. "No." He turned to Roy, who was standing near the grill with a spatula in his hand, frozen in the middle of flipping burgers, and he said it clearly, in a voice that left no room for misunderstanding. "Get the children out of the area." Roy did not move. He looked at Walt and then at Tanner, and then at the gloves on the grass, and he stayed where he was, the spatula held in the air, the burgers beginning to burn. Walt began walking toward his own house. The distance was not great. He had measured it the evening before, had noted the gap in the hedges, the uneven ground near the fire pit, the route that would take him home in a few seconds if he needed it. He walked it now at a normal pace, his hands at his sides, his eyes on the hedges ahead. Tanner blocked his path. The shove came from Tanner's full weight, both hands against Walt's chest, and Walt absorbed it the way a person absorbs something he has been expecting. His feet finding the grass, his balance holding. He did not step back. He did not step forward. He stood where he was and looked at Tanner and said nothing. Tanner threw the first committed punch. It was a good punch, thrown with the kind of force that comes from weeks of imagining, from hours on the heavy bag, from the certainty that the next moment would be the one that changed everything. Walt stepped offline, the movement small and precise and economical, and the punch traveled through the space where his head had been, and Tanner's momentum carried him forward onto the uneven grass near the fire pit, his feet catching on the ground that Walt had read the evening before, the ground that sloped where it should have been level. Tanner caught himself and turned angrier now, the embarrassment visible in the set of his jaw, and he reset and he charged. Walt evaded again, the same movement, the same precision, and he redirected Tanner's momentum with a hand on the shoulder and a step to the side, channeling forward drive into empty air, and Tanner's own speed carried him down. His face meeting the grass, his palms taking the impact. He got up slower this time. The anger was different now, quieter, the kind that does not speak because it has moved past words. Two neighbors had their phones out, recording. A man 3 tables away stood up and started walking over. Someone yelled, "Hey, hey, hey!" from somewhere behind Walt, a voice that was trying to stop something that had already begun. Walt saw Reese. She had left the shade where she had been sitting with her friends and walked over to hand him a bottle of water, placing her directly behind his line of retreat, the line he had been following back to the house. She was standing there now, holding the plastic bottle, watching him with her hands at her sides and her face showing nothing at all. If he kept yielding, the next charge would carry through to where she was standing. The calculation changed in the space of a breath, and Walt closed the distance between himself and Tanner in a single movement that was not fast so much as it was final. A level change that brought him low, an arm drag that collapsed Tanner's posture. A controlled takedown that put Tanner face down on the grass with Walt's knee on his upper back and his wrist controlled and his face pressed into the ground. "Stay down," Walt said. His voice was calm, the same voice he used to read from picture books about machines, the same voice he used to say goodnight. "Do not get up. I am not going to hit you." Tanner struggled under the restraint, the panic rising in him the way panic rises in a person who has never been held by someone who is not trying to hurt him. The struggle useless against the geometry of the position. The leverage. The weight. The man who had been walking over stopped where he was, unsure now who the threat was. Unsure whether the older man pinning the younger one was the aggressor or the one who had been trying to leave. Reese's voice came from behind Walt, quiet and clear and carrying something he had never heard in it before. "Dad, let go of him. Please. Dad!" Walt held the position until Tanner stopped struggling, until the body beneath him went still, until the submission was clear and unmistakable and complete. Then he released. He stood up. He did not look at Tanner on the grass. He did not look victorious. He looked like a man who had just finished something he had never wanted to start, something that would cost him more than the fight had ever been worth. Gordon had not stepped onto the grass to help his son. He stayed at the safe edge of the concrete walkway, his voice carrying across the common area as he yelled into his phone, saying the words that would become the first version of the story. A trained older man assaulted his son. I'm watching it happen. Send someone. Walt heard it. He did not respond to it. He looked at the neighbors with their phones and he said one sentence, his voice carrying nothing louder than a statement of fact. Preserve the videos. Then he began walking toward the house. Reese followed. She did not walk beside him. She walked 2 steps behind him at first, and then she moved ahead, her steps quickening, her shoulders set, until she was 2 steps ahead of him, and she would not look back. The cracked concrete of the driveway passed beneath their feet. The front door was ahead. The distance was not great. He could cover it in a few seconds if he needed to. He walked it at a normal pace, watching the back of his daughter's head, the way she held herself, the way she did not turn around. The silence between them was worse than anything Tanner had done. The front door closed behind them, and Reese stood in the entryway with her back to him, her breathing slow and deliberate in the way that meant she was deciding what to say first. She turned around and looked at him the way a person looks at something she has seen every day for 18 years, and realizes she has never really understood. You could have walked away, she said. You had space. You had time. Before he could answer, the first police cruiser turned onto the street, the lights washing across the living room wall in pulses of blue and red. He stepped to the door and opened it and stood on the front step with his hands visible, the way a person does when he knows the people arriving have been given a version of events that does not match what happened. Sergeant Sutter was a woman in her late 40s with gray at her temples, and the kind of procedural calm that comes from having seen enough versions of the same story to know that the first version is rarely the true one. She parked at the edge of the common area and walked toward him with her notebook in her hand and her eyes moving across the scene. There were competing descriptions from the 911 calls. Gordon had said an older man assaulted his son. A neighbor had said a younger man attacked an older one and was restrained. A third caller had said she was not sure what she had seen. Sergeant Sutter separated the parties. She spoke to Tanner first, who was still on the grass with Gordon's hand on his shoulder. Tanner's face carrying the kind of shame that looks like anger because it does not know what else to do with itself. She spoke to Walt second, standing on his own front step, his account of events matching what the neighbors with the phones would later confirm. She asked for the original video files. 2 neighbors walked over and handed over their phones, the footage showing the complete sequence from 2 different angles that told the same story. Sergeant Sutter stood in the shade of a maple tree and watched both videos twice, her thumb working the playback bar, her face showing nothing. When she finished, she walked over to Walt and stood close enough that only he could hear. Do you want to press charges? Walt looked at the grass where the takedown had happened, the trampled patch that would be green again in a week, the place where he had knelt on the back of a 20-year-old who had never learned what happens when you keep pushing a person who has already refused to fight you twice. Follow the evidence, he said. Sergeant Sutter nodded once and walked back to Tanner and wrote him a citation for misdemeanor assault, the paper handing from her hand to his name on it. His first formal encounter with a system that would remember his name from that point forward. Gordon stepped forward. His voice rose. He pointed at Walt and said the words that had always worked before, the words that had opened doors and closed investigations and made problems go away. Sergeant Sutter listened. When he was finished, she said in a voice that carried nothing louder than a statement of procedure, "Your son threw the first punch. He threw it twice. The video is clear. The citation stands." Gordon's certainty broke against the flatness of her response the way a wave breaks against a seawall that has been standing in the same place for 100 years and does not know how to move. The police ran background checks on both parties, standard procedure for an assault investigation. Tanner's record was clean except for a noise complaint. Walt's record returned a Department of Defense restricted flag, prompting Sergeant Sutter to make a phone call that verified 20 years in the Navy, a SEAL qualification, an honorable discharge written in language that did not leave room for ambiguity about what kind of service it described. Sergeant Sutter watched the video again with the background check sitting open on her laptop, the footage playing side by side with the record, the evasion, the redirection, the positional restraint, the verbal commands delivered in a voice that never rose above the level of instruction. "That's not bar fighting," she said to no one in particular. "That's training." Roy learned the truth not from a private leak, but by standing near the cruisers when Sergeant Sutter returned to tell Gordon exactly who his son had tried to hit. He told neighbors over fences and in group texts, the information spreading the way information spreads in a neighborhood where people talk to each other. The slow suburban realization that the quiet man who fixed the fence was something else entirely. Gordon, meanwhile, had begun making calls. He had contacts in the Columbus freight and logistics industry, and he used them. He told them that his neighbor was a trained, violent man who had attacked his son. The word traveled, accelerated by the cell phone videos from the cookout that began circulating locally on Tuesday morning. A client who also contracted Walt for physical security assessments initiated a routine fitness review, the kind that happens when a contractor's name appears in a context that raises questions. The review found no concern. The police card cleared Walt. But Gordon's own bid with that same client was flagged in the process. A vendor whose son is caught on video attacking a veteran, while the vendor stands by yelling into a phone, becomes a liability risk. The kind of thing that causes a bid to be paused and then lost on governance concerns. Walt learned none of this directly. He learned it through fragments, through oblique references, through the way certain conversations stopped when he walked into a room. Coach Riggins called Tanner that same Tuesday afternoon, having seen the video online. The conversation was brief. Coach Riggins said Tanner was no longer welcome to train there, that if anyone asked, he would say only that Tanner was no longer training there. No public statement. Just a door closing. Walt sat in his home office that night with the police report from the first incident open on his desk. The one he had filed months ago when the pattern had first emerged. The one that had gone nowhere because there had been no video then. No witnesses willing to speak. Beside it sat the challenge coin from the console tray. The one he had carried for years without thinking about it. The one that meant something now, in a way it had not meant before. He had the means to push harder. He had the prior report. He had the video. He had the citation. He had the truth on his side. He set it all down. He asked for enforceable boundaries and restitution for the damaged truck. He refused media attention. He told Sergeant Sutter to follow the evidence, and she had. And the evidence had done what evidence does when it is allowed to speak without interference. Weeks later, Tanner's attorney negotiated a pretrial diversion program with the municipal court. Tanner agreed to enter voluntarily, the decision his own, the choice to avoid a criminal record belonging to him and not to his father. Gordon chose not to cooperate with his own complaint against Walt, effectively dropping it the first time he had ever seen that defending his son had become enabling him. Reese came into the home office late that night, after the house had gone quiet, after the last police cruiser had pulled away. She stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides, her face carrying something that was not quite accusation and not quite understanding. "Did you stay calm because you trusted yourself?" she said. "Or because you were waiting for a reason to be that person again?" Walt looked at the coin on his desk. He looked at the report. He looked at his daughter, who had watched him do something she had never seen him do, who had asked him to stop, who had walked ahead of him and would not look back. "I didn't want the fight," he said, his voice losing the flat, measured tone he used for everyone else. "But when the system failed me the first time, I fell back on my own judgment. I trusted my ability to contain the threat more than I trusted anyone else to help. That was the flaw, not the fighting. The silence." He looked up at her. the distance between them feeling wider than the property line outside. I thought if I didn't react, if I just absorbed it, I was protecting you from it, he said. But all I did was leave you alone in the dark, watching it get closer, wondering why your father wasn't doing anything. I made you feel unsafe in your own home because I was too proud to explain myself. I'm sorry. Reese stood in the doorway for a long time. Then she walked over to the desk and picked up the challenge coin and turned it over in her hand. The way a person turns over something she has seen 100 times and is seeing for the first time. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The house was quiet. The air conditioning cycled on somewhere in the back. The refrigerator hummed. And Walt sat at his desk with his hands still and his breathing slow and the weight of having been seen, truly seen, for the first time in a very long while. The heavy bag was gone from the property line. Gordon's house had a FOR sales sign on the lawn. The letters clean and white against the grass, the kind of sign that appears when a person has decided to stop defending ground that was never his to hold. Walt's consulting contract remained intact. The client's fitness review had found no concern. He had been cleared, not elevated, not promoted, not made famous. Cleared. The way a person is cleared when the truth has been allowed to speak for itself. The no-contact agreement was in place. Tanner had completed his pre-trial diversion program, the decision his own as an adult, the choice to avoid a criminal record belonging to him. The street had become quiet in a way it had not been quiet in months. The quiet of absence rather than of tension held in check. Reese stood in the driveway beside the truck, the same cracked concrete under her feet, the same missing stereo control knob that had been missing since the first incident. Since Tanner had snapped it off and tossed it into the grass, she held a new knob in her hand. Small, black plastic, identical to the one that had been pulled off. She slid it over the bare metal shaft. It seated perfectly. She turned the volume up one notch. The radio came on. Country music, low and steady. The kind that plays in the background of a life that has returned to its normal rhythm. The sound filled the driveway the way sound fills a space that has been silent for too long. Walt watched her. He stood beside the open driver's door, one hand resting on the window frame. His posture, the posture of a man not in a hurry to go anywhere. He watched her the way a man watches someone. He built a quiet life to protect, now old enough to understand why the quiet was the hardest part. I want to learn, she said. She did not look at him. She was looking at the radio, at the knob, at her own hand resting on the volume control. He waited. Not how to win fights, she said. Her voice caught just a little, the teenager beneath the composure finally showing through. She wiped a hand quickly across her eye. I don't ever want to feel like I did today. I watched him coming at you and I thought we were just supposed to take it. I thought we were helpless. She looked at him then, her eyes bright and demanding. I want to know how to recognize when walking away stops being the safe choice. When staying quiet stops being the right thing. So I never have to stand there just watching. Ever again. Walt was quiet for a long moment. Then he stepped away from the truck and walked to the edge of the driveway where the cracked concrete met the grass of the common area. The same ground where Tanner had charged and the takedown had ended it. He pointed to the streetlight at the corner. That light has a blind spot. About 6 feet to the left of the pole, the shadow falls in a way that hides a person standing still. She followed his gaze. He pointed to the neighbor's fence, the one that had been repaired, the new wood still lighter than the old. That fence has a gate that sticks. If you need to move through it quickly, you have to lift the latch and pull, not slide it. She watched his hand, the way he measured the space with his eyes. Where you stand matters more than how you move, he said. If you stand in the right place, you don't have to move at all. If you stand in the wrong place, no amount of speed will save you. She stepped forward, positioning herself where he had indicated, adjusting her stance the way a person adjusts when she is learning something she did not know she needed to know. That's not strong, that's just mean, she said. And the words carried a different weight now. The same words she had spoken in the driveway that first day. The same words transformed by everything that had happened since. Strength is knowing how much force not to use. Walt looked at her. He did not nod. He did not smile. He simply stood there in the driveway, with the radio playing and the fence repaired and the new knob clicking into position. He had the means to teach her everything he knew. And he had the wisdom now to know that teaching her was not about making her ready for a fight. It was about making her ready for a life in which she would never need to fight at all. She adjusted the volume one notch higher. The radio played, and Walt stood in the driveway, watching his daughter, the person he had built a quiet life to protect, now old enough to understand why the quiet had been the hardest part of all.